Hello, my name is Ritonia, and I am Bishop Suffragan for Armed Forces and Federal Ministries. And my job is to recruit, care for, and support all of our federal chaplains serving in the military, in the Veterans Administration, as well as the Bureau of Prisons and any other federal agency that requires endorsement. And it is a privilege and a pleasure to be with you today in a continuing series of podcasts on spiritual matters that all of us face as chaplains, as well as ministers in the church and in the community. And it is my pleasure today to have the Reverend Dr. Janine Driscoll with us. Jean is a counselor and psychologist, and she works in the Diocese of the Rio Grande doing pastoral care response, as well as maintaining an individual practice in North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And it is just a pleasure to have you with us. So thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Well, today we're going to be talking about a topic that no one is immune from, and that is grief. And so, Jean, I wanted to begin by asking you how would you describe grief? What is it? And are there different types of grief?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Grief is a hardwired response to loss, right? We are connected. We are meant to be in relationship. And grief is the set of experiences that happen subsequent to us experience a loss. Whether what we're experiencing is the loss of a relationship, a loss of some function of our bodies, right? Or a change in our bodies, a loss of a job, a loss of a loved one. And when we suffer loss, sadness, again, it is part of our wiring as human creatures. And so there isn't like, one way that grief looks or normal grief. What there is how someone is moving through grief, how they're making sense of it, right? How their experience of the loss impacts the way they live. And that's what gets us into, like the book that came out many years ago, Good Grief, right? And that's also what gets us into things like traumatic loss and grief, cumulative grief, right? Complicated grief. These are all different forms of grief in which people get stuck somehow. That's complicated grief. Cumulative grief, I know that your chaplains are experiencing it, right? When I was doing end-of-life work and HIV care in the late 80s to the mid-90s, it was, every week someone was dying. And that accumulates, right? Traumatic grief, traumatic loss is a sudden, unexpected loss that involves trauma, which is something above and beyond the daily pale of experiences that has occurred that resulted in this death. So that's just a quick overview.
So as I'm hearing what you're saying, is that grief is a normal part of being human, because we all experience loss.
Yes.
Now, is there a right way to grieve? We hear about that book with the different stages of grief. Is there a particular way that we should be grieving?
I wouldn't say should be. Augustine, in one of his beautiful sermons, wrote about, we ought not to grieve as those who have no hope. And yet Augustine goes on to say, and grief still hurts. We're bereft. So it is how we grieve, right? And so in terms of what healthy grieving might look like, the acceptance that the death has happened. And this can be very difficult for families when they don't have the body, or they only have parts of the body, right? Acceptance that death has happened, then making sense of it as best one can. And this is a phase where folks will often say, people are telling me that I must just get over it.
Oh, I hate that.
Right.
Get over it.
And the way I frame it is, no, it is not about getting over it. It is about getting through it. So let's talk about the resources you have internally, spiritually, emotionally, and the resources you have interpersonally, right? So this making sense period, and that goes into making sense of the relationship that you had with the person. How did that impact your life? The good, the bad, the ugly. So many times, how much have you heard with families or individuals, I can't speak ill of the dead, right?
Many eulogies that I have heard people give, you would think that they were talking about the saints. Yeah.
Right. Yes. There is a big difference between naming what was, naming what happened, for better or for worse, right? Naming it is very different than slamming the person or blaming the person, right? And so moving through, and this can take a while, and it sometimes surprises people. I'll say, so what do you miss about so-and-so? Oh man, they can go on for, Then I'll say, what don't you miss? And if they're not saying anything, I'll be like, oh, they did nothing that tweaked your last nerve? Wow. Right? And then like trying to kind of giggle with them and get them to think about, because if the relationship were real, there's stuff we ain't gonna miss,
Absolutely.
And if somebody had a prolonged dying, it makes sense that there's this sense of, I'm not gonna miss waking up in the middle of the night and having to change him and change the sheets. I'm not gonna miss that. I'm not going to miss hoisting my son out of the wheelchair because his legs got blown off, onto the sofa. I'm not going to miss that. I'm not going to miss the prickliness of so-and-so. Get them to talk about the full picture, because that's real, and that's part of coming to terms with, how did this relationship impact you, right? And there's that saying that if you want to honor the dead, then live as fully as you possibly can. So then that moves into the next task. And I call these tasks. I don't like these stage models, right? The tasks remind us that grieving is a nonlinear process. So then this moves us into, how do you go about living in the absence of your beloved, in the absence of this person? And how do you go on living, staying connected with them? Now, there are all different forms that this can take. And one of the beauties of our tradition is in the communion of saints, right? And so with someone who is, in a tradition where the communion of saints is alive and well, I'll say, you know what? Who's in your communion of saints? Kind of like that commercial. What's in your wallet? Right?
Yeah,
Who's
absolutely.
in your communion of saints? And you know how in some of the higher liturgies at the Easter Vigil, there is that beautiful long litany of Saint so-and-so, pray for, and they go through, right? And what I'll suggest is, so you know, when you sit down, you can say, hey, Dad, please pray with me, pray for me. Or, son, I miss you terribly, and I don't want to put one more burden on you, but would you sit and pray with me and pray for me right now? That's communion of saints. And yeah, we can call in Saint so-and-so and anybody else. That's awesome. But our beloveds become that.
And I think about Eucharist in particular, where we can feel that connection to the saints that have gone before us, those that are yet to come.
Yes.
Which I think is just such a lovely part about sharing that heavenly banquet at Eucharist each week, is that I feel that connection. I think of my own father who passed away on All Saints' Day. And I was very close to him, as are all of my sisters. And so every time I am at communion, I think of all of those people that I'm connected to. So it's just, I think that's part of the beauty of our tradition. And for those that don't have that, I think it's harder when you don't have that to kind of rely on. So for those folks that might not have a religious tradition, how can they be connected to those that have gone before?
Yeah. So, and that's part of like one of the final tasks in grieving, which is how do you create a life without your beloved as you had known them, right? Mm-hmm. And you could ask somebody like, tell me some of your best memories that you want to share with me, because some memories are very sacred and folks don't want to share, right? And that's okay. So you can ask, I wonder if there's a memory that you just kind of savor, you know? It is like the poem says, it's like a warm light that's inside of you, right? Is there a memory like that? You don't have to tell me. If you want to, I would be honored to hear it. And so that memory is a way you can stay connected. Was there a place that y'all really enjoyed going together? You know, I've talked with some folks about, you know, did he have a favorite T-shirt, or, you know, did he have a blanket, or, you know, the guys in their whoobies, right? Right. You know, and to wrap yourself up in that, and to feel that person, to sense that person there. And there's something so wonderful when the first couple of months, the first several months, and you can still smell the person like on their clothes, you know? And it's like, don't wash that, right? And that's okay, because that's a way of connecting. Is there music that connected you? And see, what will happen, Bishop, is that the very things that bring them comfort and a smile, at the same time, they'll cry, and that's okay. Or people will say, well, you know, Janine, I've gone to the restaurant, or, you know, I've put, you know, his whoopee around me, and it makes me sad. And that's okay. Because that means you had a connection, right? And so how can you acknowledge that sadness and find a way of expressing it that gives you traction for your own living?
So that makes me wonder, what complicates grief then, if we can't do those things? What are the type of things that could could make our grief more complicated.
Yeah. Yeah. The essential feature of complicated grief is that an individual is stuck, and it is as if the loss, the death, has become the focus of their living. And sometimes this will happen because of the guilt or regret that goes with unspoken, unfinished business. Sometimes this can emerge because of circumstances around end-of-life issues or care. Sometimes this can happen because the relationship was so very conflicted. Mm-hmm. You know, there was violence, there was abuse, and when that happens, that seems to correlate with complicated grief. When people are unable to pursue other activities in living, it is like they've isolated and they are under this dome. It is the pall of death that they are under, right? They haven't gotten to that place on God's holy mountain where that pall is removed. And it's not ours to remove it, but it is ours to help them to get curious about what is it that you are wanting to experience or express or convey by keeping this dome of death over you. You are so focused right now. It's been 2 years, and your main focus is how your beloved died. I don't hear you talking about how you're living. Sometimes people will get into complicated grief as a form of punishing themselves for something.
So as spiritual caregivers, how do we help people move beyond that complicated, or move through that complicated grief?
Yeah. So one way is to talk to them about how, and this can sound kind of crass, and it's not. We continue to do things, Bishop, because they serve a purpose. What is the function that focusing on so-and-so's death as your focus of life, what function is that serving for you?
Can you give us some examples of that?
Sometimes it is about avoiding going on with their lives. You know, people are, well, they're grieving, or so-and-so, go easy on them, right? And that ought to be, right? But when you have somebody 2 years, 3 years out who's profoundly stuck, that's a problem, Some people will do that because they believe they ought not to be alive. There may be such profound survivor's guilt.
Right? You see that in the military often, when you lose a buddy in battle, or even when somebody might take their own life. Yeah. Why him and not me? Yeah, those kind of questions.
Yes, and that often comes up too, Bishop, with traumatic loss and grief. Mm-hmm. Survivor's guilt is so powerful. And especially if somebody, in a mission, they did something that was a mistake.
Again, speaks to moral injury again. Yeah.
Yeah. And so getting people to talk about that, getting people to imagine, if your battle buddy were sitting across the table here, what do you think they'd say to you right now? Imagine they're sitting here. What would they say to you right now? Imagine they're sitting here. What do you want to say to them?
Those are great questions to ask. Wow. Yeah. So, are there interventions or strategies or rituals that we can use to help folks process their grief in ways that honor those that they have lost?
Yes. Yeah. Well, saying to someone, as you knew this person, how did that person enrich your life? How do you think you enriched their life? Right? Another place to go is I do lost timelines.
Oh, tell me about those. What do they look like?
Yeah. So you get an individual, it can be on an 8x11, or you can get like newsprint, and you ask them, would you be willing to sketch out right now your earliest loss, right, through this present loss, right? And when did it happen, or who was it? And you'll see people getting busy doing this. Or sometimes, Bishop, you'll see a person go, well, my pet died, but that's the only loss that I've had. Well, that counts.
Absolutely.
Right? How did you deal with that? How was that talked about? After people have done the timeline, you can say, well, what do you notice about your timeline? Just what do you notice looking at it? Pick one of these losses and tell me how did you deal with it? How'd your family deal with it?
And do they just have to be deaths, or can it be any kind of loss on that timeline?
Good question. Yes, it can be any kind of loss. Mm-hmm. Yes, and asking people to kind of parse out with you. How is it dealt with? Because what you find is so many people, it wasn't dealt with. It was unacknowledged. If a person is, let's say they're in a same-sex relationship, or they have an animal, really beloved companion that dies, sometimes that is considered a disenfranchised loss because it's not readily acknowledged, because to acknowledge that would be to acknowledge something even more vulnerable for the person. Mm-hmm. I'm not supposed to get attached to my therapy dog. I'm not supposed to get attached to, my family pet. I can't tell anybody about this loss because this was my partner, and we were flying under the radar. Nobody knew. Disenfranchised grief. So getting people to talk about it.
And that contributes to cumulative grief.
Yep. It can contribute to cumulative grief, disenfranchised grief. Yep. Grief that gets just pushed away. And what's so important to acknowledge for all of us, every loss we experience, whatever that loss is, reactivates all previous losses. It is how we are wired.
So that's normal.
Yes. And one of the things you might ask someone about is, You're suffering right now, getting through the loss of your beloved. Have there been other losses in your life like this? Or to even say, it is just the way we are wired as humans, that every loss we experience in the here and now reactivates previous losses, especially the ones that went unacknowledged or unworked through. Were there any like that for you? To help people begin, right? To take kind of an inventory, to take stock of loss and how they dealt with it, because as painful as it is, it also has a way of profoundly forming us and making us more human.
And I think of the role of ritual in that as well.
Yes.
In the military, when you have a loss in battle, that's something that I've seen in rituals where you'll have it may be a soldier's rifle and their helmet and their dog tags, and the whole unit will gather around and they will acknowledge this loss. And recently I've seen less and less of people actually engaging those rituals. A parent will die, and rather than maybe have a service in the church where that parent had meaningful relationships, they'll do a quickie in the funeral home. Yeah. I would think that would make that grieving process maybe a little bit more difficult, because you didn't have a really structured way of acknowledging that grief. And I think the same thing with when you have a suicide. Again, you talked earlier about silence, but how do we acknowledge that this person lived and had an impact on our lives, and that, right. How difficult the loss was for all of us, to be able to name it and shine some light on it is, I think, really helpful for families to be able to kind of process it. Mm-hmm. And I've experienced that as a parish priest when we've had folks that have taken their lives, and seeing the different ways that families respond to those funeral services that the church can offer, whether they be parishioners or not. I think it's a wonderful gift that we can offer our communities.
Ritual, including sacramental ritual, is a psychic container. And what I mean by that is ritual provides the parameters for making sense of what's happened. It is so disorienting. And yet, ritual gives us these anchor points, right? Just think about our liturgy. It is this container, and even though our world has ended in that moment of the beloved's death, we know how the liturgy is going to go. We know the words, right? And like, I've certainly said it to folks, that part of the beauty of liturgical ritual is that when I can't speak the words, because there is that awful lump that's right here or down in here, and it's like, oh, if I even try to pray, it's just going to go all over the place, right? That's when community, they pray for us. Literally, they say the words that we can't say or we won't say. They keep saying it until we're ready maybe to say them again, or that lump starts to dissipate. That's the power of ritual. That's the power of what y'all do on the battlefield. To speak that, that's powerful stuff. When suicides have happened, I think in a unit especially, it's important to look at, what were the relationships, right? What kinds of relationships were among the unit.
Mm-hmm.
There are times, Bishop, and I've heard this from other clinicians and chaplains, that often some of the most traumatic events that happen in military units is the hazing. That it can be above and beyond other forms of trauma.
Mm-hmm.
And when there has been some kind of shunning or hazing that has resulted in a service member ending their life, that has got to be aired. That's got to be named, not for punitive purposes, but because unit collusion around that secret keeping is counterfeit cohesion. You know?
Mm-hmm.
So it is like, it's really like exercising that toxic stuff. In relationships that are less conflicted, the same thing that you did on the battlefield, you know, the way this person has touched our lives. You know, what can we learn about living to go on living, you know, to pay tribute to this person, right? Our ritual is about, you know, community gathering, right? Comforting, closure, commendation.
The 4 C's.
Yes, the 4 C's.
Could you say those again?
Sure. So the ingathering, the community, right? Community, the comfort. And comfort, let's remember, you know, its Latin roots isn't about, oh, it'll all be better, Anne. It really will be. No, it is with strength. It is, how do we help to bear this load, right? So comfort, closure, bringing some sense of closure, which is another part of ritual. It's not the be all and the end all, but wow, it can begin a powerful process, right? And then commendation. You know, in our tradition, what an incredible honor and privilege. You know, it's full circle from that person's baptism, right? And now to commending them back into the arms of God's Yeah.
That's beautiful.
Yeah. And so, like, how can we help the chaplains think about the 4 C's in a less, in a way that wouldn't be proselytizing, right? So does that look like maybe talking with a unit about the 4 C's and saying, hey, y'all, what ideas do you have? Or what would be meaningful for you? Right? And going from there.
Those are great questions to ask a unit, to ask a community. I can see that specifically even in like a school community when there's been a loss like that, is to ask folks, what would be meaningful? How could we as a community support one another? And how can we honor this person's life and then let them go and still keep that connection to them? So it's all very powerful.
Yeah, and here again is a place where, and this could be a whole nother topic, survivors, they may have survivor guilt and or be furious. And helping them to navigate that, helping them to speak what they didn't have a chance to speak, you know? When it happens in a congregation, if it were to happen in a unit that had everybody religiously formed, you know, what can be beautiful is to pray the litany for the dead. Because, like, as soon as people find out about the suicide, to say, hey, we're gathering at the church, or we're gathering here at 7:00. We're going to pray the litany of the dead. Yeah, is that usually when the person is imminently dying? Well, you know what? We didn't get a chance. And back in Jesus' day, they believed that maybe it was a couple of days before the soul left the body, right? So we are going to pray the litany of the dead.
So important, particularly I think with when you have kind of those traumatic losses.
Yes, ma'am.
Absolutely. Wow. Well, there's a wonderful program that I've experienced called Walking the Mourner's Path.
Huh.
And it talks about many of the things that we've discussed today, but about naming those things that we, so miss and honor our loved one, but also those things that weren't so perfect, and then looking at ways that we can touchstones so that we can honor their life. And then the use of ritual, forgiveness. Maybe there are things that we need to be forgiven from in our relationship, or we need to forgive that person who was gone and we didn't have an opportunity to say that. So that's something that that program is really wonderful. So particularly in the community, but I think that's something also that our chaplains could use. So we'll have some links to that at the end of this particular podcast.
I would hope that folks would maybe hit the replay button for that last part that you were talking about in terms of the forgiveness and the mutual forgiveness. That, Bishop, wow, that is so key.
Well, I think it helps mitigate complicated grief when we hold on to all those things. So, is there anything else you'd like to add, Janine, before we finish?
I have a slinky in my office. And the reason I have the slinky is because how we talked about all losses reactivate previous losses? Yes. And so what you'll often hear is a person years later will say, but I thought I dealt with this when my dad died, or I thought I dealt with this already. And so I'll take the slinky and I'll hold it out and I'll send a ping pong ball in. Mm-hmm. And what that represents is the grieving is like this. It's nonlinear. And at different times of our life, different seasons of our life, we see the same thing, but from a different angle. Think about how that slinky is, right? But it's forward moving. And it may be revisiting, and it's, what does this tell me about moving more fully into living? What does this tell me about my fidelity to my baptism, right? And then when we're talking about grief, how do your chaplains tend to their own grief?
That is a good question, and probably the topic of another podcast. Yeah.
But like you said, your dad died on All Saints' Day, And so is there a way for our chaplains to gather with you virtually even, and have a liturgy that is about commending all those people in the last year who have died? But how do chaplains tend to their own grief?
It's a great question. Well, thank you so much for this time today. We so appreciate it. And if you've got more questions about grieving, we'll have some links at the end of this podcast. Thank you all for your attention, and God bless you.